Welcome everyone to our Leadership Fireside Chat series. My name is Helen Malone. I'm the National EPFP Director. We welcome all of you to our series designed to lift voices of our EPFP alumni from across the country and across the decades. Today we're joined by our 2009-2010 Missouri EPFP alum, Gislaine Ngounou, who is interim president and CEO of the Nellie Mae Foundation and also a member of our IEL board. We're so pleased to have her today. And before we get into discussion, we just want to share a little bit about IEL. The mission of IEL is to partner with under-resourced communities to equip leaders to better prepare children, youth, adults, and families for post-secondary education and training, rewarding careers, and civic and community engagement. EPFP is an integral part to IEL, and we are now in our 58th year, focusing as really a large national fellowship program that engages a diverse and collaborative community of strategic leaders to promote equitable public policy. We have over 10,000 alumni across the country, and some of you watching are probably one of those alumni. So we encourage you to visit us on our website to learn more about IEL at IEL.org, as well as follow us on Twitter at EPFP_IEL, as well as at IEL Connects, and stay in touch with alumni with IEL's wider networks and learn more about ways to continue to engage in our three pillars of policy, leadership, and networking across EPFP. For more episodes, visit us on our IEL's YouTube channel by searching Institute for Educational Leadership. There you'll find other episodes from alumni from across decades and across various policy positions who are sharing their leadership journeys in ways that EPFP has informed their practice and where they are today. So I'm very pleased today to welcome Gislaine to our Leadership Fireside Chat. So welcome and thank you.
Hey, thank you so much, Helen. Thank you. It's my honor and pleasure to be here. And hi, everyone.
So to get us started, tell us about your professional journey and about your current work.
Thank you. It's so good to be here. This opportunity had me really thinking about how far I've come since my days as a EPFP member. And I think my professional journey is so tied to my origin story, which goes back to Cameroon, Central Africa, where I was born and raised. And being born and raised there, faith and the value of education as two things that no one could ever take away from me runs deep, and it ran deep in my family and ran deep in my upbringing. And there is a joke that if you are born of African parents, they've decided before you arrive into the world what you are going to be and do in life, right? And there are only a couple of choices: doctor, lawyer, or engineer, right? Like it's a joke, but it's pretty common. And so I studied electrical engineering early on, and I realized 2/3 of the way into my degree that it was not my calling, and probably that it wouldn't be the path that I would take in life. And I graduated because that needed to happen, so my parents wouldn't freak out and my family wouldn't think I was going through a crisis. And while in college, I happened to get involved with the Children Defense Fund Freedom Schools as a servant leader intern when I was a college student. And I felt so at home in the types of social action, culturally responsive, critical literacy, justice-centered work that we did back then. And the Freedom Schools really were modeled after the Freedom Summers of the 1960s during the Civil Rights era. And doing that work reminded me that all along, from the time that I was a kid, I loved to help others. I was one of those kids who just happened to be good at school, and helping and organizing learning and teaching and debating things and arguing were really things that I enjoyed. So after I graduated from college, I became a teacher and started out my career as a middle school math teacher, primarily working with immigrant and bilingual, multilingual learners and families. And, I had to put that engineering degree to good use in a STEM subject, right? For it to actually make sense and not feel like those 4 years were a waste of time. And I will say I've been extremely fortunate to meet educators and mentors along the way who took an interest in me and invested in my development. So I had opportunities to teach when I became a teacher, and then to get really involved in curriculum development, in policy review, and in instructional coaching. So working to help grow and strengthen other teachers. And I eventually left the Midwest in search of more. I was in Kansas City, Missouri, and that's also where I was an EPFP member. And I eventually left the Midwest in search of more opportunities and more solutions, because I realized that the more work I did, the older I get, the more I accomplished and got involved, the more I uncovered that I didn't know. And the more questions I had, the angrier I became about the inequities in school systems and the fact that the young people I work with always were sold the short end of the stick and were really not given options that will help them thrive. And so I left, right? Some mentors encouraged me to leave and to go learn more. And it landed me in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I completed my doctorate degree in education leadership at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I saw an opportunity after getting my doctorate to work in school systems and in organizations, thinking about how to make central offices in school districts function better and in better service to families and to young people, really thinking about how to build culturally responsive schools, how to more effectively partner with families, how to improve opportunities and content for for adults to change and grow their practice, including educators, how to support and coach system leaders, and how to move racial equity learning and practice at various levels of an organization. And I really thrive in that work. It was also really hard and really exhausting and really lonely. And I learned a lot, learned so much. And like I mentioned earlier, the more I learn, the more I realize how hard it is to dismantle systems of inequities, right? So I never thought I would come into philanthropy. So when the opportunity presented itself years ago to come to the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, I almost didn't consider it, right? Like I did not identify as a philanthropist. And what changed my mind was the wise counsel of, once again, mentors, and realizing that this particular foundation at the time was really taking some giant steps to center racial equity more explicitly and more unapologetically in its mission and how it worked with communities. And I was also very mindful of the fact that women of color, people of color, women with my identities don't necessarily enter foundations and philanthropy in senior roles. So there was a calling and there was a purpose that I had to answer. So here at Nellie Mae now, I get to do work to support the dismantling of racial inequities in public education and to champion community efforts throughout the New England region. And I get to do this work with the amazing, amazing support and leadership of the team I work with daily and the communities that work with us. So that's a little bit about my professional life and my journey.
Thank you for sharing. So who sparked your professional journey? You mentioned that you benefit from a lot of mentors, but is there somebody in particular who sparked the journey where you are today?
Thank you, Helen. This question just made me pause and be really grateful, right? And I have to start with my mother and my grandmother. My mother is an African woman who worked tirelessly and sacrificed so much for her children to have things that she didn't have, and for us to have the best education that she could position us to have. So her example and her professionalism and her work ethics and her perspective really inform who I am. My maternal grandmother, who is 102 years old now and who has no formal education, is also the wisest and one of the smartest women I know. Right. So her example inspires me and informs my point of view about education, who it is for, who it is from, who gets to define it, and how our people actually hold funds of knowledge that are really, really, really important. And like you said, right, I mentioned many, many mentors. I can't name them all. Two of them come to mind in particular, the Reverend Dr. Joan S. Parrott, who taught me to always answer the calling and focus on my assignment. At the time I met Dr. Parrott, she was the vice president at the Children's Defense Fund. And she saw my leadership potential and parts of my future before I even became aware of them. And from the time I was 19 years old, she would throw me into these leadership opportunities and moments, right? Because she believed that I could do it. And her example of leadership just really, really is one that I hold dear. Dr. Gus Jacobs, without whom my EPFP journey would not have been possible. I'll say a little more about him later, but I have to give him a shout out here because he opened that door. The young people who ground me in a sense of purpose and accountability. I started out my career in education as a teacher, and I still remember the experiences of my students back then. And then the young people that we are so honored and fortunate and privileged to work with and support from my role here at Nellie Mae. And then the leadership of folks who hold marginalized identities, especially other women of color and particularly Black women. Those are just a little bit of, of examples to kind of like share what sparks my professional journey and what inspires me to get up every day and do the work that I do.
Thank you for sharing them. So how do you describe your own leadership style and who has informed how you lead?
I really believe in the concept of Ubuntu. It's an African term that means that I am because you are, I am because we are, and it takes community, right? So I do not subscribe to notions of heroic leadership, or that there's only room at the top or room in certain spaces for a select few. So I will say my leadership style is very relational. I don't believe that the work does itself. People do the work. And when we take care of each other and we take care of the people who are in the work with us and in community with us, right? Like I think together we are able to design better solutions, ones that are far better than anything that I could do on my own. And I believe that as a leader, I can have a vision and set some parameters. However, it's really, really important that those I'm in relationship with and those who are in the work with me have space to bring their own visions and their own points of view for us to create something that is collectively greater, as I was saying earlier. I asked my team earlier, I'm like, how would you describe my leadership style? Because it's one thing to see myself in one way, and it's another thing for folks to share how they experience you. And one thing that came up was, trust. I think I am a leader who leads to trust and, authorize people to run and thrive and to come to me and to find each other when we need support. But I believe that people are brilliant and possess genius in them that allowed them to manifest the work that we all are committed to do. And for the most part, I've held in high esteem the importance of reframing polarizing issues so that folks can find generative space to develop solutions. So as a leader, I would like to say I'm collaborative, right? Because I'm constantly trying to find places and entry points for us to move away from differing positions that take us nowhere in order to actually find ways to create, right? And ways to get better. And then last, I will say that I still believe that while I'm a collaborator and I like to make room under the tent and under the umbrella for everyone, because I really, really believe that equity and justice work are everyone's work. My leadership style is also about speaking truth and being courageous, even when I'm afraid. And in today's socio-political context, I think that's really, really important and really key.
Thank you for sharing that. So to kind of now move into the EPFP, kind of experience. Tell us about your EPFP experience back in 2009 in 2010.
Yes. One of those mentors I mentioned earlier was a graduate school advisor of mine, and his name is Dr. Arthur, goes back to us, Jacob, who is and was at the time at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And he got to know me well as an educator and opened up opportunities, right? He helped me generate financial support to apply to EPFP and to the Missouri/Kansas City cohort at the time. And I was surprised. I'm like, why me, right? Like, I'm an educator. I don't consider myself a system leader. But then again, right, like, I think he saw things in me that I couldn't quite see clearly at the time. And that experience of going through EPFP really ignited my interest in understanding policy and how much of a lever for change it is and can be. Now, it was so long ago, right? Like 2009, it's like over 10 years ago. So I actually need to pause and recollect things accurately. At the time, I was an instructional coach and a curriculum writer. And I was also in the process of finishing a graduate degree in school administration that had me on a trajectory to become a principal. So EPFP was such a tremendous opportunity to be connected to others who cared deeply about education and change. And there was such a breadth and depth of experiences because of the backgrounds and different levels of positioning in the sector people held, right? Like, I was an instructional coach and did some like work in curriculum writing at the district level, but we had principals, right? Like, we had a couple of folks who really were involved with city government. And it was really important to have those differing perspectives and experiences because the level of conversation and content that we got to unpack and analyze really quench my thirst for a space that graduate school alone or staff meetings or professional development opportunities at the district level did not quite provide for me. And I was in the Midwest, right? So having access to EPFP beyond the Missouri cohort also made me become more open. And you know how sometimes you don't know what you don't even know? Like, you don't know because you just don't know. So exposure to the national network helped me to see that the challenges that we face locally in Kansas City at the time, and even in the state of Missouri, were even more systemic, right? Like, B, that there were others who were grappling with similar questions and developing some interesting solutions worth exploring, right? So it provided an opportunity to kind of lean into some like hopeful and promising practices with others, and to also share and have others reflect back on like what we were trying in our local context. I will say that EPFP also demystified for me and made the world of policy, right? It made it more accessible and it made it more approachable. Like, I think before EPFP, it always felt like, you know, policy is that other world, that other land that we don't touch and that we don't make explicit connections to. And then when folks talk about, you know, the nexus of policy and practice, which I really got into at the graduate level, particularly when I was working on my doctorate, I feel like EPFP was really my entry into that, right? Like my entry into making some clear connection between district policy, city policy, state policy, and then like learn to navigate federal policy that had an impact on us on the ground in my context. And as an educator, I was able to hone some tools and to develop language to understand systems, barriers, and to also organize myself and organize others, right? Like, I think it changed some of the nature of my conversations with my educator colleagues, right? Like to dig to the level of like root causes, or when we were organizing and helping parents navigate the school system, we could also bring in language related to policy, right? Like, because any change in practice that they were advocating for and fighting for, had to be backed by policy that will allow them and us to like sustain the change efforts that like we were all working so hard on. And I don't often think about it in these terms, but I will say that my EPFP experience helped my aspirations also to do more and to dream of change a bit differently. Like I mentioned earlier, I was on a path to become a school leader, like did my internship, was set to go, had some offerings. And I would say like EPFP was one of the many factors that helped me see beyond my very small sphere of control at the time.
So that actually leads to kind of the application of knowledge. So how have you applied the pillars of policy and leadership networking and the knowledge you've gained through EPFP?
Okay, I think I shared a little bit of that in the last question. So I'm going to try to get concrete with how I do my work and how I move through the world now. When it comes to the policy pillar, right? Like, I think right now, public education is so in the spotlight, right? Like, I've always wanted public education to be a lever that we talk about more when we talk about justice and when we talk about democracy. So for me, I would say the policy pillar right now shows up as tracking legislation, right? Like, we see bills being erected in states across the country around anti-critical race theory efforts, right? Which we all know, right? It's really not about critical race theory, but it's about an affront on teaching history and teaching the truth in our country. I will say from a policy lens, right, it is very helpful to have gone through EPFP and to understand the level of policy to help track legislation in New England, but also track legislation at the federal level, because it has direct implications for what school systems and what educators are able to do. And then once we can shed light on that, I can lend, and I have lend my voice, right, to speaking out on issues, to amplifying the voices of educators, amplifying the voices of activists and grassroots leaders, leaders of community-based organizations who have more risks at play, right? So there are things that they want and need that they can't necessarily say or do because the risks are too high. So my policy and advocacy work means supporting what they directly want by speaking out against or in support of legislation that make their work possible. From a leadership standpoint, I think my EPFP experience, as I was sharing earlier, helped me make connections from the school building level to the district level to the state level to like the federal level. So as a leader, right, like I'm always thinking about leadership as asking the question of like, who is most impacted by what we're talking about or decisions that we are about to make? And then answering that question by mapping out who our stakeholders are and like the folks who are more proximate to the challenges, the folks who are more proximate to the solutions that we seek to implement, and ensuring that leadership tables and decision-making processes and practices have voices of those folks represented at the table. It will be easy, right, to just come up with a set of parameters and come up with a set of goals and strategies and implement what I want or implement what we want as a funder. But I believe that leadership through the lens of EPFP and this pillar is really ensuring that there are connections being made and that leadership is activated and catalyzed at all levels, right? Like young people have a point of view. So at Nellie Mae, we have a community advisory structure that includes young people, and they get to inform the design of our work, the design of our grant funds. They also get to participate in grant making and review applications. So that's an example of how like I've used that experience to expand my notion of leadership and to really engage in the capacity building efforts of others. And then from a networking, the third pillar is networking, right? From a networking standpoint, again, right, like you heard me talk about Ubuntu, like I really don't believe any one of us, individuals or organizations, can do it all on our own. So networks to me, like this pillar translates into like, find your people, right? Like you have to find your people no matter what organization you are or what level of change you choose to take on. And for me, finding my people means staying really connected to education and what happens in teaching and learning, what happens in classrooms, what happens in how we build culturally responsive schools. But like in the role that I'm in now as an interim president and CEO of a foundation who has a lot of privilege, right, and great responsibility that comes with that. The networking pillar now means connecting with my fellow funder leaders, right, to see ways in which we can engage in like some mutually reinforcing activities to fund the type of work here that brings about educational justice and liberation, or how we like position ourselves in the gaps, right? Like if one funder is funding a set of efforts that necessarily don't align with the mission of the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, we find gaps and things that they can't necessarily do, and we position ourselves there so that together our efforts are mutually reinforcing, right? Like ways to support each other, but also ways to hold each other accountable, right? Like when we get a little bit lost. So that's networking for me, just, you know, finding your people and supporting one another and calling each other in as necessary.
So that leads very nicely to the next question. What is a piece of advice that you share or you would offer to our EPFP fellows watching this?
Piece of advice. I'm always leery of advice because I'm like, oh, you know, I don't really believe anyone is an expert except on their own life. But I would say, one, get involved politically at your local and state level. Become more versed in how the systems and institutions in your geography function. Like I did some of that when I was like an educator back in Kansas City. And this is what, 11 years ago now, 12 years ago. And I wish I had done more, right? And I think EPFP positions you to be able to do that and to be able to draw on your network, right? So get involved politically at the local and state level. And we know this is crucial now when there are midterm elections coming up. We know school boards and school board elections have become a place where good organizing happens for good, or organizing happens in ways that actually hinder some of the aims that we have around equity in public education. So it is really important to figure out how to get involved politically, locally and at the state level. Number two, connected to that, I will say lean into learning more about and analyzing power and power structures. I feel like we don't do that enough, right? Like, and there are so many root entanglements in our communities. So I will say, yeah, spend time thinking about what power means, what power looks like, who has it formally, who has it informally, how do you understand it? How does it translate into structures in your local context? So that you become better versed at navigating those power structures for good. You don't formally, maybe this is a number three. You don't formally have to become a policy wonk, but you can think about how the combination of your skills, your experiences, and interest are helped by having a policy frame and in turn drive change efforts at whatever level of the ecosystem you choose to position yourself in. Like, you don't have to know all things about policy, right? Like, but like having a point of view about policy, having a frame about it, I think gives you a different vantage point to kind of align that policy frame to work that you really, really care about, whether it's in teaching and learning, whether it's in organizing folks, but you might decide you want to become a policymaker or a politician. Great, we need really great ones out there. But having a policy point of view and frame is really key. And I would say, I'm trying to think about this. I believe it's always important to pay it forward, right? And to give back. And EPFP is such a tremendous opportunity. So figuring out the level of a version of the learning and the skills that you are acquiring through EPFP that you can bring back to young people and others in your community who are yearning for and hungry for more, like hungry for knowledge, hungry for different ways of thinking about issues and tackling them. People who do not have access to the type of opportunity that you're leveraging through EPFP, figuring out how you bring that knowledge back and also allow other people to tap it. And these people might be young people, right? They might be in the middle school and high school, or they might be parents who are organizing in your community. They might be people who are running for office. I think it's important. It's important to figure out how to pay it forward in that way, And then last, I'll just say, there's so much work to be done, and there's room for all of us under the tent to do it. And I was in a recent conversation with Alicia Garza, who is at the Black Futures Lab, who, reminded us at the end to just, keep going. Like, there isn't a handbook or playbook for it. So take this learning, connect, leverage the network, and then figure out how to like bring it into your specific work, which means you need to make time and space to like imagine and dream about what that looks like.
Well, thank you for that. This is a great pieces of advice. So last question, then tell us actually about your current work, your role in the foundation, and how your work advances equity in education. It's an opportunity for our fellows to also learn from alumni, both about their journey, but also their work and how they can connect to it.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm at the Nellie Mae Education Foundation. I think the name suggests that we fund education. And our mission really is to champion efforts that communities are pushing for, right? To dismantle racial inequities and to advance excellent student-centered education as defined by communities in their respective sphere. So that's our mission, right? And what that work looks like, it looks like really investing in leaders, and leaders being leaders of community-based organizations, education leaders that include teacher leaders, and young people, right? And investing in building their capacity to do what they already do well. It also means, for us really investing in community and school partnerships. I don't have the stats in front of me, but I believe that we have more than 13,000 school districts in the country, and almost between 45 and 50 million children and young people in schools, and traditionally we know community voices, especially in historically undercapitalized and underserved and marginalized communities, folks haven't had a seat at the table, right? Like at the design table or the decision-making table. So we invest in the type of community and school partnership efforts that have communities and schools designing an equity agenda together, and implementing that equity agenda together, right? Like that whole concept of nothing that is for us without us. We try to operationalize that. And our third main goal to kind of meet our mission, right, is really about movement building and investing in advocacy and coalition and policy efforts that help to catalyze and sustain the work that educator leaders, that leaders in education are doing, and that community school partnerships are seeking to operationalize. So we see that policy, advocacy, coalition, movement building lever as really crucial to sustaining change efforts across communities. Our work primarily centers the New England region. We are a regional foundation, so we fund in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. But we're also clear that what happens at the highest levels of the system nationally also impacts our region, right? So we have some investment in some national organizations that support the work that our grantees and communities are doing on the ground. I'm often asked, like, okay, racial equity is so broad, right? Like, what dimension of it are you working on? Are you like taking on climate change? Are you taking on like, what version of racial equity is Nellie Mae really particularly like steep into? I would say, like, for us, like what we've learned, because we really try to listen to communities, that's one of our core values as a funder. What we've learned is that a lot of the work in our region really is centered around like 5 core areas. Like, one is investing in the ending of the decriminalization of young people in schools. So breaking the school to prison pipeline as an example, building culturally responsive schools, which can look like attending to the educator diversity pipeline, how we recruit, how we keep, and how we make sure that educators of color and diverse educators come into the profession, stay in the profession, and are set up to thrive. Inclusive policies is a third area that our grantees and communities are really working on, really primarily thinking about the experiences of bilingual, multilingual, and immigrant young people, and how to protect young people and children who are members of our LGBTQ community, and making sure policies are accessible and inclusive for them. Resource equity, like having equity in resource allocation, is another area of equity that our investments attend to. And, you know, doing all of that by ensuring also that we're listening to community voices, right? So we fund some direct efforts that are organized by parents in the region, right? And it's great work. I'm honored to be in that work with the team at Nellie Mae. Our board has been on this journey right alongside staff. And when we started implementing this new strategy, this strategy is now 2.5 years old. We also made the decision to start a community advisory structure, which are people who sit at all levels of the educational ecosystem in New England. So young people who are in high school to a couple of people who are district leaders. We have a couple of teachers on the community advisory structure and a couple of leaders of grassroots organizations, you know, and together they help inform our strategy, how it's designed, how it's implemented. And because philanthropy is such an interesting space where we can be so steep in oppressive practices, they also call us in, right? Like when we really aren't living into our values and mission. So as the interim CEO and president, my work is to kind of guide and champion and support the team that makes all of this happen, while also ensuring that our internal work happens, right? To change the system and to transform the ecosystem, we have to transform ourselves. So I get to think about racial equity learning internally and how we change the way philanthropy has served and not served communities well for generations. So that's a little bit about the work that I get to do now.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for your time today to, you know, share with us about your leadership journey, about your EPFP experience and the work of the Nellie Mae Foundation. So thanks to you for your time, and for all of you for watching. Join us for other episodes of our Leadership Fireside Chats on our YouTube channel for Institute for Educational Leadership. And we'll look forward to seeing all of you in our next episode. So thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.